What's up, y'all? Welcome to Renegade Culture. I'm Dr. CBS.
And I'm Dr. Layla Brown, and we're here for the takeover.
Period. But hold on, what is wrong with this camera?
As I combine all the juice from the mind, heal up, wheel up, bring it back, come rewind. Powerful impact, boom from the cannon.
Oh,
Renegade
Culture.
Yeah. You know what it is? Renegade Culture's in the building.
You know what I'm saying?
Fuck what you heard.
That was really good. Yo, what happened? There was some other folks in my seat, man.
I don't know, man.
I don't like that.
Looked like things was going on.
I know, there's some blonde hair over here, you know what I'm saying? I don't know what's going on in that. We don't like that.
Thought your lace front was fronting.
You know
Trying
what
to
I'm
figure it out.
saying?
Okay.
Yo.
What's poppin'?
Yo, Renegade Culture, how you doing? And the real host are here. You got Kamau K. Franklin with.
I'm the mighty Kalonji Changa, aka the riot starter. Act like you know, and
True.
you don't know, you will know.
Damn, no, that was a... and who we got back there?
We got no other than the ear doctor in the building. What's what?
Okay.
And boy, Jai High in the building.
What up, Jai High?
No
Okay.
minister server today.
No minister server.
Mr. Server out hanging with his homeboys out in Detroit and shit.
Yeah,
Doing
doing
up
his
gang
steps.
signs and some shit.
True.
They stepping in the name of love. Shout out to man, Minister Server out there.
Hope he ain't doing that.
You know what I mean?
Yo, we got some students. What's your name real quick? I know they had on mics. Just say your name. Oh, Ty. Monique?
Michelle.
Thank y'all. Man, you can't say shit else for the rest of the show, but we appreciate that. Thank y'all so much.
Damn,
You know what I'm saying?
Misunderstand. Ty been jumping around for the last
I know,
30 minutes,
man.
bumping into shit, knocking my shit over. Like,
Throwing up signs and shit like that. I don't know. You got
He said, what's your name? Ty.
You know what I'm saying? Almost as smooth as my man, Ja.
I think Ty about high as Jai.
No, maybe. You know what I'm saying?
Anyway, welcome to Renegade Culture. This episode, like, I don't fucking know no more. But
Yeah.
we in here. You know what I'm saying? We got a lot of live shit to talk about today.
We got a lot of good shit to talk about. We got, as folks saw, like two comrades from Black Power Media going to be our special guests tonight. We got Dr. Layla Brown and
Okay.
Dr. CBS.
Okay.
We're going to talk all things international. We're going to talk about Haiti, Cuba, what's happening in South Africa.
Okay.
Come back around, talk about U.S. Empire.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? And we'll have a little fun too. A little fun, you know, because our folks
got
are
some
here.
fun?
Yeah, man. We got folks in studio. You know what I'm saying?
for real.
But before we do that,
That's what
we
we
got
gonna
some Patreons.
Oh,
Patreon time. All right, check this out. So big up to David Gandini,
Oh, okay.
Big ups to Latasha Levy.
Noah Cheetos,
Here the
College
fuck up.
Grade School.
Tony
And Davis Obinga in the building.
Obinga.
Oh, that was a near fuck up. We're going to give you a little credit for that.
I think they
was not
probably
the
fucked
names.
at least 2 or 3 people.
Yeah. It was kind of like, yeah.
Keep it consistent.
This dude chicken scratch. You gotta try to read.
Oh,
it.
damn.
Scratch.
yeah.
You know what I'm
Okay.
saying?
Anyway, real live show tonight. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna have a good time.
Yeah.
Happy to be here. I'm tired as fuck. We've been doing remix morning show every goddamn day.
I haven't been, but you know. You tired. I got breaks, motherfucker.
actually
You know what I'm
work.
saying?
Yeah. Interviews and shit with other people and shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, but it feels good. We have a good weekend.
That's
about
right.
to get live out this
Yep.
No doubt.
Anyways, Renegade Culture, we back in a few ticks with our guests. Don't touch the motherfucking dial.
Peace.
Saturday Renegade Culture's in the building.
You know what I'm saying? We back with a brand new hot show for 'em.
Okay, got a whole lot of shit going on. We got a couple special guests tonight.
I know, you know what I'm saying? We got people from the BPM family, from the Black Power Media family.
Okay.
We got our very own Dr. CBS.
Doc CBS in the building. What up, Doc CBS?
You know, out here, happy to be here, funky, fresh, and in the flesh.
Okay.
With, you know, the BPM comrades.
That's how we do around here. Also in a place to be with a fresh, crisp, Home Ain't Easy shirt. We got no other man.
Crispy, no wrinkles.
Chris.
No, it's not though. Pay sex workers.
Okay, not the paid sex workers.
We
All
just
right.
said it. Dr. Layla Brown.
Dr. Lady Brown's
Did
in
I
the
get the
building.
name right that time? Okay, we killed
You
keep
did
trying.
better.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
better.
He's working on it. He practiced all
You
week.
know.
Anyway,
It's hard to say Layla.
we have a good time. We got a lot of serious shit going on right now. You got things going on that's been popping off. We've been talking about on the Remix Morning Show. We've been talking about
Cuba. Yeah.
We've been talking about Haiti. But some of the things we haven't talked about South Africa.
Yep.
And we haven't talked about Swaziland, which Swaziland changed its name back in 2018 to
Eswatini.
Eswatini. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of bullshit popping off out there as well. So we're going to deal with all that today. How y'all feeling?
I'm good. I'm just, like I said, glad to be back in a city with black people.
No doubt, no doubt. Now you was out in Venezuela recently,
Yes.
right?
About, I guess, 2 weeks ago now.
Okay. If you don't mind, you know what I'm saying, we know there's a lot of shit popping up in Venezuela as well. Can you give us a little recap or something?
I mean, I was there for this global conference that's a follow-up of a series of conversations that the government has been hosting and paying for people to kind of come together from all over the world to talk. And so that particular Congress was the Congress for the Peoples of the World. And there were people from indigenous communities, Afro-descended communities, LGBTQ communities, media, people who work in the media, people who are labor union workers, cultural workers, educators, to think about all of our separate roles as people who are united in this struggle on the left, right? What does it mean to be a teacher and be working towards revolution? What does it mean to be, a person in the media working towards revolution? What type of work should we do, and how can we collaborate? And so that's the sort of big picture of the conference. But there are still a lot of things that are in the works that are coming from that.
Did you notice any differences between when Chavez was in office and now? How's it looking over there?
For sure. The first time I went to Venezuela was in 2011, and I was there for Chavez's last election. And I know that was in 2013 before he died, and or was it 2012? I can't remember. But as the media tends to do, it blew up the situation, and people thought there were it was like a civil war happening in the streets, which it was not. But I would say that the biggest changes, I think, have come in the last couple years. I think as the sanctions have increased, as it's been more difficult to import medicines and import foods. Actually, one of the things that I noticed, not so much this time, but in 2019 when I went back, is Caracas is a city kind of like LA. Like, the traffic is terrible. Mm-hmm. And there were very few cars on the streets. And one of the reasons for that is because of the blockade, a number of things can't be imported to fix cars. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the metro system, I remember the Caracas metro system was fast and efficient and clean, and it's really kind of falling apart now. So there are a lot of really infrastructural damages that are happening because of the country's inability to kind of keep up with things. And
what about the flights?
Oh yeah, well, and also because of the blockade, you cannot actually travel straight from the U.S. to Venezuela. So those of us who are coming from the U.S., most of us either had to go through what's the joint?
Dominican Republic.
Yeah, well, I flew through the Dominican Republic, but then Cancun. I'm trying to think of vacation spot in Mexico. And that's also a weird place to fly through because it's, it's also known for a lot of drug trafficking. And so moving through Cancun to come to Venezuela is just another way to get harassed. But because of that, it's hard to get back out because there are only 1 or 2 flights every couple of days. So
it sounds like the travel, it sounds like, years ago when I traveled to Cuba, it was the same thing.
Yeah.
You had to go to the Bahamas, or you had to go through Mexico, or you had to go to Jamaica. And all this kind of ties into kind of like the central theme is how, there seemed to be a block on the left in South America, in the Caribbean. We had Venezuela, Bolivia, obviously Cuba along stay. We had some action with Aristide a few years ago, but we've had the U.S. now making maneuvers to do what it can to sort of break up that block. So as we sort of dash around, we see what's happening now in Haiti, we see the most recent events in Cuba. What do you guys think is kind of happening in terms of what's behind all this right now in terms of some of the turmoil?
Well, I think it's really interesting to see the dialectic between right-wing populism on the one hand and the upsurges and left mobilization and left governments on the other hand. So, for example, a socialist was just elected in Peru. And so I think that there's a really strong political and ideological struggle happening right now. And I think that this sort of divergence is manifested in Cuba on the one hand and Haiti on the other, right? Because Haiti had a very right-wing, U.S.-backed, dictatorial, undemocratic dictator, basically, in Jovenel Moise, who was recently assassinated. On the other hand, you have a socialist government in Cuba, but that has been under duress because of the blockade, exacerbated by COVID, exacerbated by the fact that they're unable to get just basic necessities. So, for example, Cuba had developed 5 vaccines, but was unable to get syringes, vials, etc. And so all of this is, undergirding all of it is U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism, and the increasing the increasing sort of entrenchment of Western domination in these areas because of the continued left-wing push, right? And so I think that we see this happening in Brazil, in Colombia, in Haiti, in Cuba, and throughout Latin America and the Caribbean more broadly. And so the most recent upsurge in this was the quote unquote SOS Cuba, right? Which is like an astroturfed US-backed ostensible pro-democracy struggle. And we have to always be weary of this discourse of pro-democracy, right? Because we hear it with the Hong Kong protests, and it's always a means of rationalizing or legitimating U.S. intervention or Western intervention, and of undermining socialist or counter governments that are counter hegemonic to the West. And so I think that all of these things are happening right now. And the other important thing is that historically, Southcom, the Southern Command, is the most underfunded command of all of the U.S. commands. And so, with all of this uptick in conflict in Haiti, in Colombia, in Cuba, et cetera, it legitimizes more funding for Southcom, which means more militarism, more intervention, more surveillance, et cetera. And so, I think that all of these things are happening right now.
But even though Southcom has been the least funded, the U.S. has stayed with its eyes on Latin America because, I mean, even what we're talking about, this kind of trend, right, is often referred to as the pink tide. And, Cuba is understood as kind of like a grandfather of this moment. But then when Chavez comes to power in 98, and then, later on, and they're not all, we're talking about like kind of center-left, right? So then you have Lula in Brazil, and you have the Ortegas in Nicaragua, and I think there was even a brief moment in Argentina over the last 20 or 30 years. And it does seem like, one of the things that I always think about is that this tide, it keeps ebbing and flowing, because there are moments when, like, you look at all of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and there's this big shift left. And then there's this moment of re-intervention from the U.S. And, to really see the contradiction and the hypocrisy of it all, we can just look to the recent protests in Florida. Because, the anti-riot laws that DeSantis just passed in response to George Floyd. In response to George Floyd protests. He basically said the stuff that the Miami Cubans are doing is nothing like that.
Doesn't apply to the reactionaries.
To them, right?
Period.
And so
those are the good niggas.
Exactly. Well, you have the right to be out in the streets and protest and demonstrate as long as you're doing it, in favor of the U.S. government.
It's funny you mentioned Colombia, and Colombia keeps coming up. And Colombia has the most U.S. bases inside of that particular area, in that region. What role is Colombia playing right now in regards to the Caribbean and Latin America?
Well, Colombia, they say that Colombia is the Israel of South America, period. It is the strongest ally of Southcom. And the other interesting thing, too, the connection to Haiti, is that ostensibly these mercenaries that were behind the assassination of Jovenel Moïse were Colombian, right? Former Colombian military. And as we know, the U.S. military trains the Colombian military, does many Southcom exercises, many military exercises in Colombia. And so even if it is that these were Colombian mercenaries, they got the Made in USA stamp, period, right?
And they're the ones that said, U.S. should intervene. They were the first ones to jump up when the whole assassination took place.
Yes, exactly. The other interesting thing about Colombia is that because historically, so in terms of thinking about Southcom being underfunded, there was a man called General Kelly who was testifying before Congress in 2013, and he's talking about, he's basically having to defend why Southcom keeps its resources and needs more resources. And one thing that they're trying to do is connect the war on terror with the war on drugs. And so this is where, if you notice, the narco-terror discourse coalesces around Central America and South America. And so basically what they're making this argument that drug traffickers are both funding and creating the conditions for terrorists to come through South America, through Central America and Mexico. And so there's a way that the immigration discourse, the war on terror and the war on drugs discourse is tied, and Colombia is very central to this because they're historically the sort of archetype, the center of the drug war. And so this is ongoing, and it's very, very important to think about these connections, because most of the money from $780 billion of the military and the defense, right? The defense industry, the military industrial complex is going toward like the Indo-Pacific and the Mid-East. And so they have to continue to make this link with terrorism and this link between those threats that are being funded in order to gain more resources. And as we know, with the situation in Haiti, for example, they're basically just trying to get a captive labor class, to get captive markets, and to allow for these corporations to have basically their fiefdoms in Haiti and in Cuba if they have their way, with the cheap labor source. And so this is the way that the military industrial complex comes together with, you know, private capital, and with Southcom being the sort of the boots on the ground.
So we're going to take our first break. And come back and continue and pick up on this discussion about U.S. hegemony in Latin America, the battle between left and right. And we're going to shift focus too and get to what's happening on the continent when we come back on Renegade Culture.
Yeah, fuck General Kelly. What's happening, Renegade Culture? We back again.
You know what I'm saying? With our BPM family.
Okay.
Dr. Brown and Dr. CBS.
Okay, the doctor's in the building.
See, I extended the S on it. I did the CBS.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Wasn't that cool? You like that, right? No? Okay, my bad. Let's keep it going.
Quirky sense of humor.
I do.
Definitely quirky. Quirky Kamau. It's all good. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Quirky.
Quirky? I don't know if I like that, but let's get back to it. You know what I'm
That's
saying?
kind of
Let's get back
sensitive,
to
but
it.
it's all good. Anyway, we live and direct. We've been talking about a few different things. Southcom, talking about what's going on in Latin America, in the Caribbean. You know what I mean? And you know, you mentioned General Kelly. General Kelly, monkey ass, he was responsible for a whole lot of shit around the world. He went from Southcom to Africom. You know what I'm saying? He's a true criminal. You know, we want to dip a little bit because of the fact that we know that the world's been talking about this debacle in Haiti and the whole thing with Cuba and the connection, because of the fact that I don't think that we should take for granted that it's just a separate thing going on. I don't think that it's, I think it's a perfect military design. What's your thoughts on that?
Definitely.
I mean, Haiti and the Dominican Republic are strategically located. I mean, geographically for access, right? You know, the U.S. could never quite get its hands on Cuba the way that it wanted to. And ideally, something that's 90 miles off the coast, you know, would be an ally for the U.S., but they haven't been able to work that out. And so, I mean, just from, like you said, basic sort of, strategy, tactics, like it's a place where they want to be. But I mean, also, I think, you know, with Haiti, you can never talk about the Haitian predicament and not think about the fact that they've continued for 200 years plus now to be targeted and demonized for daring to say fuck y'all, like, you know, we're not doing this anymore. One of the things that always really struck me about the Dominican Republic, and I guess why it's such an easy place to be a U.S. ally post sort of the Trujillo years, is to think about the fact that when Toussaint came to power, really one of the few things that he demanded was to end slavery on the entire island. But a lot of Dominicans, not all, but a lot of Dominicans celebrate their independence from Haiti rather than from Spain. And so that is actually something that years ago got me started thinking about the sort of racial, geopolitical implications of all these places and sort of what's happening there. So I mean, I think, you know, from a very basic standpoint, Haiti's a strategic location, but in the same way that the US continues to like put its foot on Cuba's neck and Venezuela's neck, Haiti's had the U.S. and the world's foot on its neck for 200 years, and we can never take for granted that this is always about continuing to make this case. Like, if you try, this is the shit that will happen to you. And I think that, you know, we can't be deterred by that, right?
Well, you know, Cuba has always presented a fundamental threat because it represented socialism in the Western Hemisphere. So, for example, the Cuban Revolution had particular consequences for Guyana. So the Guyanese government was suspended twice, once under former colonial administration and once right directly before because of the nomination of Cheddi Jagan and the PPP. This is before the PPP was split racially. So initially when the PPP was founded, the People's Progressive Party was an interracial party. Both Burnham and Cheddi Jagan were founders. It was interracial. because of U.S. and British machinations, it split into the PPP and the PNC along racial lines. But when Chetty Jagan was nominated, I want to say in 1963, the government was suspended a second time because they literally said they didn't want another Cuba, right? Not only that, so the United States had a particular development model that it wanted to export throughout the Caribbean during the independence era, called industrialization by invitation. This is something that there's an economist called W. Arthur Lewis, and this is what he thought the model was for Caribbean islands that had a large labor supply, schmo, blah, blah, that basically these islands would invite corporations in to come and develop in exchange for things like tax breaks, the whole shebang, right? And of course, Cuba provided an alternative model to this. And so much like Haiti providing an alternative to African enslavement, Cuba provided an alternative model to capitalist development. And so I think that both of these nations have been suffering under retaliation from the United States and the West more broadly because of, number one, challenging the slaveocracy on the one hand, and then challenging capitalist hegemony on the other. And so we see this playing out in manifold ways, not least with what's happening in Venezuela, the continued efforts to destabilize Cuba and to paint socialism as an abject failure, when indeed and in fact the failure is the blockade and sanctions. And so this is just essentially what's happening throughout Latin America and the Caribbean.
You guys brought something up before we went to break around the use of the drug war. And so it back in the 60s, 70s, it seemed to be more overtly the United States suggesting or saying, obviously, that it's battling leftist government, 60s, 70s, 80s, up to what happened in Nicaragua and so forth. But then it became almost like the war on terrorism became the excuse for toppling governments or interfering in governments in the Middle East and so forth. Here it seems like the war on drugs has been used as sort of that entry point for more U.S. military intervention, DEA, CIA, FBI. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in terms of Latin America and so forth?
I mean, one of the most egregious examples was during 2020 when the U.S. government decided to put Nicolas Maduro and Diosdado Cabello on the most wanted. I think there was the, what was it? It was $15 million for Maduro and $10 million for Cabello. And they basically, for narco trafficking. That's it, right? Like, so, I mean, I think I don't know, it's just, it strikes me sometimes how like weak the connections are and how to even make that claim, right? And all of this is a part of, I mean, obviously we know there's a long game that they're trying to play, but in that moment it was about still trying to legitimize Guaido, right? Who, when he declared himself president in January of 2019, I think statistically something like, I don't know, like a single-digit percentage of the country knew who he was. And the reason why I didn't know who he was, because the man spent the last 15 years in the U.S., like, training, working with people who work with the School for the Americas, I mean, so it's no surprise that when he tries to come back and, impose himself, that people don't know who he is. But then what's even interesting is that Venezuela is particularly since Chavez died, is not anywhere near, I think, as organized and as sort of deeply entrenched in their own understanding of socialism as maybe Cuba is. But one of the things that's really been interesting is the fragmentation of the right in the Venezuelan case. And I think that, a few years ago, the right in Venezuela, the right in general in Latin America is further to the left than the right is in the U.S., right? Not left, but just, slightly left of that. And I think in the last couple years, we've really seen the right push further right in the Latin American case. And we see it with all of these different Leopoldo Lopez, and even the ways that, and what's his name? No, I was thinking about some of the other folks that have tried to run for president in Venezuela, but even how they try to disassociate themselves from one another. Despite the fact that there are pictures and texts and all kinds of evidence of their relationships to each other in the public sphere, right? Not like this private backdoor kind of stuff. And so obviously, in terms of your question, thinking about how the U.S. is utilizing the drug war, I think it's even more interesting because, the face of the drug war in the U.S. is very sort of it's brown, it's black,
Yeah.
right? But I think the face of the drug war in Latin America, it's not just racialized, but it is, as Charisse was just saying, it's about trying to target socialism. And I think anybody who has followed Venezuela understands the flawed nature of the way they've tried to implement socialism. And I think that none of these governments are without critique.
Yeah.
But I also think that, for us as U.S. citizens, it is their right to decide for themselves in their own countries what it is that they do. But I also think that we have to be able to continue to look at and observe these experiments with socialism, because we don't know. We don't know what it can really look like, particularly in the post-colonial world, where so many of these countries were forced into sort of monocrop societies. I mean, that's one of Venezuela's biggest problems. I think like 89% of its GDP is based on oil. And so a country that has literally the Amazonian forest in it doesn't produce its own food, right? And that's a big deal. And the reason why it doesn't, that's a part of the afterlives of slavery and colonization. And so even in thinking about kind of diversion, I didn't mean it that way, but it is a part of that, right? And trying to think about what it means in the post-colonial world to actually be able to sustain ourselves and to see what that looks like. It has to be a joint venture across countries. Like, no single country can make that happen.
Yeah.
I think that's something else we need to add into this conversation is Guyana, especially when we're talking about oil, because as we know, at the beginning of this year, there was the whole, was that this year or was that 2020? The whole election crisis. I think that was this year. The years all run together in COVID times. But, the whole election conflict. And prior to that, right, it was 6 billion gallons of oil, something like this, were discovered in Guyana, and Guyana becomes a strategic location to launch a border war with Venezuela, to continue to undermine Venezuelan sovereignty, as well as to breathe new life into the oil industry, not least ExxonMobil. And we know that this deal that Guyana signed with Exxon was the worst deal literally in the history of the world, in terms of the environment, in terms of labor, in terms of extraction, in terms of tax breaks. Everything was the worst possible deal. And this undergirded the struggle, the fact that the extant government did not want to give up power, because in the final analysis they needed their kickbacks. It's more complicated than this, but I think Guyana is really important. We don't know very much about this country, but it's always been a place that has been of strategic importance. Again, going back at least to the 1950s, when the British and the Americans undermined the PPP the first time, not least because they're afraid of another socialist government, but also because of the natural resources that are there and because of its strategic location. And so all of that to say, the U.S. battle against socialism in Cuba and in Venezuela has ramifications for all of South America, for all of the Caribbean, for Central America, and also for us. So,
and it's a big battle, because it's funny, when I first started going to Venezuela, all the maps in Venezuela of Guyana, they always mark the territory as territory and reclamation. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're all serious. Like none of them lives Guyana. So that's not a big intervention, but that was giving me context for when I was first getting like, oh, why is this always listed like this in that particular context? Mm-hmm.
Hey, man. Welcome to America, the place where imperialism and capitalism is the product of the day. It's ill that you're talking about, we're talking about Latin America, and we're talking about the Caribbean, and it's the same playbook internationally. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's the same thing, fucking up the environment everywhere, snatching up the resources, enslaving people, murdering folks, police killing people, so on and so forth. When we come back, I want to talk about what's going on over on the continent right now. We know it's the same police terrorism. We know it's the same quote-unquote food shortages. We know there's a couple fat motherfuckers at the top eating the people literally, you know what I'm saying? So we want to dig into all that in a few minutes, and we want to talk about how destructive these motherfuckers are. We come back, Renegade Culture. Back at Renegade Culture, during the break, we was talking about Kamau chambray shirt. You know what I'm saying?
You said it low. You couldn't even get the word out. You can't get. It's a jean shirt.
It's a jean shirt.
I don't know.
It ain't
white jean shirt, it would be as heavy as your jeans.
Yeah.
That's why it's chambray.
It's
just made to look like that.
Definitely chambray, brother.
I don't know what the fuck no
Chambray and
is.
champagne.
Touch my shirt.
Call this nigga Sham from now on.
He's a sham.
I like my sham.
Oh, sham ass nickel. Anyway, speaking of sham, let's talk about
True,
sham
South
government
Africa.
over in South Africa. You know what I'm saying? They go. You like how I did
That
that?
was a good segue. That was smooth.
I know. I'm Kalonji. What the
For
fuck?
you know,
Anyway, yeah. So
Too much credit.
see, it's okay. I understand that. Haters everywhere we go. Anyway, I thought we was on the remix for a second there. But anyway, yeah, let's talk about South Africa. You know, a lot of folks talking about Zuma as if he's the only issue that's going on in South Africa, and like his 15 months is the reason folks are out there tearing shit up. So let's talk about South Africa. What's the deal out there, good people?
I mean, I think this is another question to media, right? Like, even because I've been talking to friends, some of the viewers know that I spent all of 2020 in South Africa, for which my friend here has been very upset with me. But should be all right. But I've been talking to a lot of friends about what's happening, and you know, it's really misrepresented as chaos or unrest because of Zuma. I mean, there are similar, in fact, there are similar issues with the way the current population understands Ramaphosa. In particular, some of the deals he made during COVID, and even the way he turned his back on the mine workers, right? And in the ways that he was complicit, if not responsible for the deaths of mine workers at Marikana, right? So a part of, you know, what's happening in South Africa, also because South Africa is just so unequal. Though, I mean, the way that people, you feel it and see it on an everyday basis is so obvious. In particular, in a country that is almost 90% black, right? Where people who are indigenous to that place just get, you know, for the most part, the worst of the worst. And then even the black people who don't necessarily live in those kind of poor predicaments just overwhelmingly have a particular kind of conservative, reactionary, or even sort of performance of a particular kind of whiteness, particular kind of bourgeois sensibility, a way of being. So a lot of the unrest is just really about the ongoing understanding of how unequal the society is, on top of how wealthy it is, right? And even when I was there in 2020, I forget what the hashtag was, but there was another set of what they call xenophobic attacks, which are usually only targeted at other continental Africans, almost never at, you know, white folks, never, and not even really with black folks from maybe the U.S. or the Caribbean. It's really even more so like Southern Africa and Nigeria. Those are the two places. But I think there's something like a 60% youth unemployment rate. It's somewhere around that number. And so there were a lot of battles over younger people wanting to have certain clauses that required the government to employ, you know, South African citizens as opposed to Zimbabweans or Mozambicans or whatever. And so a lot of what's happening at this particular moment, I think every time we see globally, when we see like riots or rebellions, that's always the last straw, right? Like, it's always the product of a number of things that have been building up, and that's just a particular opportunity to demonstrate or display that in that moment. And I think that as people who are trying to look at the world and at history properly, like, we have to always take that into account. This is never about the singular incident. This is not about, you know, Zuma's refusal to provide his, you know, receipts or lack thereof or whatever he spent his money on, but it's just about yet another transgression, like yet another way that this class of people is able to take advantage of poor people in South Africa.
And in some way, this is the build-up from sort of post-apartheid South Africa and the failures of the ANC to do anything constructively around changing who owns the wealth. Obviously, when Mandela was out, certain accords were signed around keeping the wealth in the hands of the whites, and black folks would have, Africans themselves would have political control for whatever that meant.
Absolutely.
And so this seems to be that build-up where it seems like the ANC itself is now coming apart and is no longer obviously representing the side of the resistance because it is now obviously for the last 30 some odd years been the government, right? And has not done anything except for performative work to change the conditions of the people on the ground.
State of desperation.
Yeah, and in some ways, some people, I think it's similar to the way we even think about the sort of post-Jim Crow moment in the U.S. There were some things that worked in different ways during apartheid, and that there are some things that feel even more egregious post-apartheid, right? Particularly the way that like certain subsections of the black population ascend into particular kinds of bourgeois positions and then become arms or agents of that same kind of exploitation. And I think, the EFF is not without its own issues and contradictions, but there's a reason why the EFF is gaining traction in this moment. One, because of the overwhelming size of the young population in the country.
Tell people what the EFF is.
The Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a newish political party in South Africa.
Julius
Malema.
Yeah, the median age. Well, just that the median age in South Africa is 21, right? And so the median age, so Swaziland, which we'll talk about, or East Swaziland, which we'll talk about in a second, is the median age is 17. And so Africa, the continent as a whole, is a young continent. And so when we see these uprisings, it's really contemporary, right? There's the legacies of colonialism, the neo-colonial independence era, apartheid, etc. But these are really kind of new contradictions that are arising that these young people are rising up against, right? The continuation of the comprador class, continuing the subjection of the overwhelming majority of the people. And, the ways that, for example, like the ways that the Western media focuses, the ways that, not the ways in which, that, the Western media focuses, for example, on Zimbabwe. So there's been sanctions against Zimbabwe since 2003 because they took the land back from the white folks, putting no attention on the last absolute monarchy that exists in Eswatini. What is it? Eswazi? I don't know. Eswatini. So I feel ambivalent about that because the name, because the absolute monarch declared that the name, and it's no better than Swaziland, which is the colonial name. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, but at the same time, so when we talk about Zuma and his corruption and his ostentatious wealth, it's the exact same thing for this absolute monarchy and his family. Like there's 60% unemployment in, I'm just saying Swaziland, period. Sue me. Right? It's the same type of economic conditions. Not only that, the overwhelming industry is manufacturing. And so prior to this current protest, there was like a general strike for better wages, better working conditions. On top of, and the problem is that the media, the Western media, and even places like Al Jazeera keep calling this a quote unquote pro-democracy. As I said earlier, we need to be very weary of this fucking pro-democracy discourse because democracy and the American nomenclature or the American conceptualization means Western intervention. It means Western domination. It's a very particular type of, imperial electoralism, right? They don't care about any changes in the material conditions, only these sham elections. And whenever they get tired of propping up whatever dictator or whatever absolute rule that had previously served them, then they start to parrot this pro-democracy line. And so I think that there is relationships between what's happening in South Africa, what's happening in
Eswatini?
There you go. And also the discourse even around what's happening in Ethiopia. Democracy, human rights, humanitarian aid, etc. There's all of these discourses that are used to reify imperialism, to continue Western. Right.
That's the Trojan horse.
You see? Exactly, because it's not just, it's the U.S., but it's also the United Nations, right? We think the United Nations is this objectively good force. No, right? In the Caribbean, it's the OAS, it's the core group in Haiti. And so it's all of these entities that are essentially meant to underscore Western power and Western domination, extraction, domination, and continued political subjection, right? And so, and especially in the context of increased like Chinese relations, right? China's relations in South America, in Africa, in the Caribbean. And so the U.S. is doubling down on its militarism. The West is doubling down on its militarism to combat like Chinese influence. And so, as they say, like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But we see all of these different connections that are happening throughout the globe, and especially the way that racialized people, colonized people are subjected to these forms of domination.
You spoke about, you mentioned, we talked about Eswatini and also Cuba, right? And around the same time the embargo was imposed on Cuba, Swaziland or Eswatini broke away from British rule, I think about 63 years ago. And now it's the last monarchy in Africa or on the continent. I want to talk about this king. What the fuck is his name? I can't even, I'm fucking his name up now. But anyway, this rat bastard, he's living lavishly, like most of these dictators do. And at least 1 million people over there starving. It's the crazy thing about it actually borders South Africa when you talk about the whole unrest in Mozambique. So I wanted to kind of touch on those politics over there because of the fact that I know that they've had some problems with police terrorism over there. I know there was a law student murdered by the police back in March. I believe his name was Debone Gobene, something like that. I'm fucking up right now, but he was a young law student. I think it was in his final year of law. They murdered him, and there's been a lot of the government has been going hard on a lot of the folks who've been protesting the same issues that they're protesting in Cuba, the same issues they're protesting in Haiti, same issues they're protesting in South Africa, food shortages, gas, so on and so forth. I want to speak on that a little bit. Like, how's that?
So you can speak to Eswatini, but the question that you asked made me think about two particular things that happened last year during COVID. So I don't know how many people know this, but South Africa was one of the few countries in the world that made alcohol and cigarettes illegal during COVID. The logic was that the rate of alcoholism is so high, that the number of cases in the hospital, whether it be like drunk driving or even spousal abuse related to alcohol, if they made alcohol illegal, it would free up spaces in the hospital for COVID stuff, right? But we also know that anytime you make shit illegal, a black market just pops up.
Is that how you got all that wine?
Calm down. But there were two people. One man's name was Collins Kosa, and I believe he was in Cape Town. But there was another one in Soweto, in Johannesburg. These two men in particular were murdered by the police, beaten to death because of having alcohol, which at any other time is completely legal. But because of these, emergency laws and whatever under COVID, they lost their lives for a beer, for just standing outside of their homes, right? And so to even think about the notion of the police state and the way and the similarity of tactics, right? Like, I think one of the way, and that's so even in terms of what we were talking about before about this being a sort of buildup, one of the things that you could see across South Africa, even during this alcohol ban, you could go to like super uber wealthy parts of South Africa, and you walk into a restaurant and they give you the wine menu, even though it's illegal. Meanwhile, in the townships, they have been told that they can't even congregate on their lawns. And to be outside and have a beer is punishable by death at this particular point in time, right? And so again, like the way that people are responding in this moment is about so many different things, right? And even in thinking about the youth age and thinking about the lack of employment, and not to bring it back to the U.S. again, but that's essentially what happens in Ferguson. There was so many young people who were not employed, who had nothing to do, and so they were able to sustain that level of protest for as long as they were. And so there are these, similarities that we see in conditions and circumstances where people, I think, are overwhelmingly pushing for something different, something better, and that, we just keep getting knocked back on our asses with every time.
I mean, I think the only thing I want to point out quickly is that it's not only just the police, it's also the military. So what was happening in Eswatini, bang, bang. What was happening there is that the police were being overwhelmed by the protests, and so they were calling in the military. We saw this happening in Colombia. It's still happening in, the declaration of martial law. We see this happening in Haiti, right? And so the way that the military is often trained by the United States or the West, AFRICOM in the case of Africa, or Israel, the IDF, is turning inward, right? And so this is another function of imperialism, is that the way that the military and the police go hand in glove. And so we even saw this in 2020 with the calling in of the National Guard. This is the military that's being mobilized domestically. And so we're seeing an uptick in this as these states are crushing protests, right? And again, as Layla was saying, these are last resorts. This is not, this is out of desperation. And the extraordinary violence is being weaponized against people by both the police and the military. And so these conditions are being exported globally, right? Because the U.S. is currently, hegemonic, not necessarily economically. Well, it's reaching, U.S. imperialism is reaching its asymptote, but what is happening is that it's exporting it, death, carcerality and military violence as like a commodity. And we're seeing this happen in all of these places that we spoke about this evening.
Amen. Now I was going to say quickly, and even though we didn't say specifically class, obviously these are, particularly in Africa, are sort of class conscious wars that are being fought between the underclass and those who have. But yeah, I just wanted to add that little part. I mean, you guys are great. You guys should have your own show or something. We should think about that on Black Power
Possibly.
Media.
We might think about
Fill
that.
out an application.
Call it LDI or something.
Yeah, I like that. Last Dope Intellectual,
It might be
something
dope.
like that.
Yeah.
We came up with a good idea. You know what I'm saying?
Thank you. I see that. Anyway. Anyway.
Just let them have it.
Shout out to all the fighters out there, over in the Congo and Palestine, in Peru and
Free
Chile.
Palestine.
And I mean, it's just all over the world is so much fucking resistance. It'd be a wonderful thing if all of a sudden everybody, all the fighters of the world woke up and said, you know what? This is fucking capitalism and imperialism. We got to crush these motherfuckers and turn on them. I had a dream about that shit one time. Dream the fucking animals in the zoo, they came the fuck out. The fucking sharks and shit in the motherfucking big ass aquariums and shit.
Hey, RIP to the salmon boiling to death in Oregon and in the Northeast.
How high were you when you had this?
Excuse me, yeah, Pacific Northwest.
Okay,
and also, the folks, fighting out there in the Amazon, man. You know what I'm saying? These fucking industries fucking up the environment. Yeah. But we're going to get to that another time. We'd like to thank you all for coming up on this motherfucker, Renegade Culture.
Thank you.
You know what I'm saying?
Welcome.
Every now and then we have some intelligent motherfuckers like myself. And then Kamau comes through.
Rip my nice shirt.
Yes, he comes with the chambray.
Chambray.
Yes.
Anyway, Renegade Culture, thank y'all for joining us. We see y'all next week.
No doubt.
Bam.
Stay chambrayed up.